Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today, it is my immense pleasure to introduce a great scholar and a great friend of mine, Dr. James Fox of the University of Cambridge. James is the author of the forthcoming The World According to Colour, A Cultural History, which will be out with Alan Lane later this year in September, I believe. But many of you will be most familiar with James from his many appearances on our TV screens. It would take the length of the interview to go through absolutely everything that he's shown us. But some really crucial and recent stuff includes The Age of the Image, a four-part TV series on BBC Four in 2020. James also led us on a guided tour of Tate Britain in Culture in Quarantine in 2020. He has a forthcoming radio series on Radio 4 called The Future of Art, and a forthcoming TV series on art and nature with BBC Two. And for the early modernists in the audience, James also presented a personal favorite of mine, the three-part, I think, is that right? A very British Renaissance, which I watched with incredible enjoyment just a couple of years ago. So he's someone whose expertise spans centuries and continents, but who's here today to talk to us about the experience of making TV from scholarship. James, thanks so much for making the time.
Pleasure.
I wanted to start off by asking you a little bit, in your own words, I suppose, about your own research background, about the kind of work that you do.
Yes, I'm an art historian, and despite my forays into other periods, I focus on modern art and particularly modern British art. I did my PhD on British art in the First World War, where I was taking a kind of social history approach to how art and culture was changing in this period of great social crisis. That was published by Cambridge University Press, I think about 5 years ago or so. And since then, I've continued to publish on that subject and around that subject. I continue to publish on sort of first half of 20th century British art. I've just finished a piece about an aviator artist during the First World War, and I'm also working on the relationship between art and knowledge in the 20th century. So I've just signed a contract with Manchester University Press to do a big edited volume of essays about the way that artists relate to different fields and disciplines of knowledge through the 20th century. So it's mostly 20th century stuff, although my interests, as you've alluded to, are much wider. And my book, The World According to Colour, is one that really does have a great chronological and geographical span. It's one of the reasons why it's taken me 8 years to write. But for me, it's, my work is driven by curiosity. I think all the best work is, actually.
I feel like I can hear academics thinking, only 8 years? I think we're
Yes.
used to these longer timescales, aren't we? But it's certainly a book that I'm really looking forward to reading. I wanted to ask you a bit because alongside this kind of research and teaching career, you've also made a name for yourself in making TV. And I wondered if we could kind of go back to the start of that. I wondered if you could tell us a bit about how you first set foot in the world of TV art history.
Well, I should say that, I was always, as a teenager, I was always really interested in documentaries on television. I was, the first person in my family to go to university. I wasn't from a very intellectual family. My friends weren't very intellectual. I wasn't living in a particularly culturally rich environment. And so a lot of my intellectual and cultural nourishment came from TV. It came from watching those early Simon Sharma documentaries. It came from watching Newsnight Review and seeing Tom Paulin and Germaine Greer battling it out. That was where I got my intellectual interest, my cultural interest. So it was always something that was very interesting to me. And about 15 years ago or so, there was an advert in The Guardian that said wanted art history researchers to work on arts television, and I couldn't believe it. It was like the dream job. I applied for the job as a kind of researcher writer, and I got the job, astonishingly. And I ended up working for Valdemar Januszczak, who's an art critic of the Sunday Times and has done a lot of arts programs for many years now. In fact, those were some of the programs that really got me very excited about art in all those years ago. So I spent some years working within television, but from a sort of research perspective, which was quite interesting because I got to learn from Valdemar and from others, how do you how does television differ from writing for other things? How does it work? How do you make a program, and so on and so forth? But that was very much behind the camera. The way I got into presenting was actually a very strange scenario in which apparently some of my students had written to the BBC behind my back, I think as a prank, to say, oh, James should be on television. And apparently this letter or this email went around, bounced around BBC departments for years. I was completely unaware of it. When I got an email out of the blue from the commissioning editor, the arts commissioning editor at BBC, saying, come in for a chat. I went in for a chat. Now, at that point, this is about 10, 11, 12 years ago, arts programming was dominated by sort of old male presenters, and I think the BBC was really going for a concerted effort to bring a younger presenters, younger on-screen talent into their programs. And I was one of the 2 or 3 people who happened to be there at the right time. They offered me, they gave me this taster tape to film. I'd never presented before, and I did this taster tape in Cornwall, and I was absolutely terrible, really, really terrible. I had no clue what I was doing, but for some reason they ended up commissioning the program, and I did it, and it was an enjoyable experience. But I knew I was a terrible presenter at that point. But then I got additional programs after that, and gradually learnt the skill and the craft, because it is a kind of craft, of how to do it slightly better. I mean, I still think that there are people who are much better at me at presenting than I am, but I have certainly improved through practice over the years as a presenter.
I'd love to think a bit about the kind of the practice and the learning experience that you have, because I think one of the things we're trying to do with these conversations is to really think about the how, the work that goes in, quite literally behind the scenes, in kind of making. God, I almost said outputs. I can't be using these terrible terms. The university has rotted my brain. But yeah, so I wondered then, in that case, could we think about the different elements of the process of getting a show on TV? And I suppose, in my mind at least, that begins with a pitching process, and kind of getting an idea in front of commissioners and really selling it to them. What's your experience been of pitching shows?
Well, normally a presenter, unless you are Simon Sharma or David Dimbleby or Andrew Marr, normally presenters don't really have the role of pitching projects that they're interested in. Usually what happens is a production company will come up with an idea. They will have a team of people involved in development who will be writing up these pitches. Their job is solely to write proposals, and they write dozens of them a month, throw them at commissioning editors and hope that some of them stick. And usually what happens is someone will contact you from the development department and say, here's a proposal, are you interested in having your name attached to it? You can say yes or no. You can tinker around with the proposal, make it a little bit more your own or not. And then some of those projects will come off, some of them won't. I've been lucky that a number of the projects that I've worked on, in fact, most of them, I guess, have come from the BBC itself, that they have said, we'd like to do a project on, X, Y, or Z. Would you be interested? And then I'll say yes. So, the pitching process, I haven't had it's not an entirely conventional pitching process. And I remember one of my my earliest series, I did one on British art in the 20th century and one on 3 colours. These were simply, I was sitting having a coffee with the channel controller, and he said, what would you like to do? What would you be interested in doing? And I said, well, I've always wanted to do something about colour. And he said, fine, let's proceed and do it. And then of course you have to write up the proposal and jump through the certain hoops. So yes, but it can be a very protracted process. And the series that I'm now just beginning to film at the moment, which is Art and Nature for BBC Two, that pitching process began 2.5 years ago. So it's been it was a 2-year process between the initial pitch, which actually came from the BBC, and the beginning of production. So it's a long process. You need a lot of patience, and a lot of the projects, 99% of them, aren't going to get made in the end.
It'd be very frustrating, I could imagine. But I wanted to ask, actually, if we would take a sideways step there, and you mentioned working with production companies, and I think sometimes, people think about the process as being, Scholar goes to the BBC, the BBC says yes, the BBC makes the program, right? Whereas, of course, with so many of these shows, a production company is absolutely central to every bit of the process, and they're kind of bidding or pitching to the BBC themselves. What's your experience been like of working with production companies?
Yeah, well, generally speaking, there are the two forms of production company or outfits that I've worked with. Although it's changing now, actually, the way the BBC is run. Through most of my career as a presenter, there was BBC in-house, which was part of the BBC, and they were producing 50 or 60% of arts documentaries at the time, and then the other 40% or so were being produced by independent production companies, indies as they're known, that were dotted around the country. In some ways, they were both the same thing. They were both production companies, but it was a very different experience working with the BBC. Generally, it was a much larger organisation. They were much, much better connected to the channel. But in some ways, also you had less flexibility. You were less nimble than you could be with an independent production company. And as is the case with anything, I would say that there are good production companies and bad production companies. There are production companies that pour the budgets on screen, and there are production companies that pocket most of the production, the budgets. There are production companies that really care about what they're doing, and others that just want to get the programs made as quickly as possible. So I think if anyone is interested in working with production companies, it's always good to ask people in the industry if you know any, and also, of course, just to look at their back catalogue and see if the programs they make are good or not.
That sounds absolutely key, doing that kind of research. And I suppose I wanted then to ask about the process after pitching or after kind of saying yes to to a concept or something like that. So when you have a sense, okay, this is something that's going to be made, we now need to start hashing it out, we need to start writing, we need to start researching. And this is, I think it's great that you have the experience of being in front of the camera, but also, as you said earlier in your career, a lot of experience of working on the research side as well. And what kind of work goes in? Obviously, this is going to be different from documentary to documentary, but can you give us a sense of the kind of work that goes into writing and researching documentaries of the kind that you're making?
Yes, I think before I do that, I just want to, I think a very important point that I want to make is that so often when academics, and indeed the public, watch programs presented by other academics, they just presume that this person has sat down and written an essay and that everything is essentially down to them. The truth is that the production of a television program, more so than a radio program, but even for a radio program, is so collaborative, and there are so many restrictions. There are so many things that you can't say, that you want to say, that weren't possible, that you wish were possible, that go into the finished project. Great lines, great descriptions of works that get cut out in the edit against your will, that ultimately the finished product is not, you can't judge it in the way you would judge a book. In terms of the process, generally television production is divided into three segments. There's pre-production, production, and post-production. You, I think, with John, were asking about pre-production. This is the period in which the researching, the writing, the setting up of the shoots goes on. These things are done in very different ways, and presenters are very different. Most presenters aren't really involved in this at all. Most presenters, they might send a document at the very start of the process just to say the kinds of things they're interested in. But then what will happen is an assistant producer will go off and set up all the locations and set up the interviews, and a director will write the script. And then usually that script is sent to a presenter a few days before production, and they just get to sort of fiddle around with it. Some presenters don't write a single word. They just, get the script on the day and they just read it out. Others will tinker, on location. I have always written my own scripts and done most of my own research. So for me, it's a quite time-consuming task. I like to put my scripts together myself. I find that that's how I satisfy my curiosity, how it feels genuine for me and authentic. but it is very time consuming. So yes, I will, while in the pre-production phase, while the production side team are setting up the shoots, I am there, writing away the script. And I must say, this is another thing I've learned, is that writing a script is a very different discipline from writing a book. And I think or an article, and I think, or even a lecture. And I think if academics saw a script, and sometimes we send our scripts to consultants, they're kind of flabbergasted. They don't understand. They're completely bewildered by what they're looking at, because they're quite confusing in terms of formatting, and also you're not using many words. You're using, in fact, the best scripts have the fewest words, and because you've got to build these stories through dialogue, through music, through atmosphere, through pictures as well. So it took me a long time to work out how to write a script, and what makes a good script. And what makes a good script is not the same as what makes a good essay.
Can I ask, did you have to, so you've talked about kind of taking that quite independent role in kind of writing those scripts and kind of doing your own research. Is that something that you've had to fight for? Is that something where you have encountered, where you've encountered pushback? Or yeah, do you have to kind of stake your claim to be author as well as presenter?
Well, so it's different. It's different. Some directors, and these are the people you're working most closely with, some directors don't like it because they feel it's their job to write the script, it's their job to construct the narrative, and that can lead to occasional frustrations and conflict. But other directors love it because it means that they can focus on, getting the shots right, choosing the locations, going on their recce's, while you do the sort of spade work of, chugging through the library and seeing that, writing the pieces to camera. I should say that when you're writing a script, generally there are two components to it. There are the pieces to camera, which are the bits you deliver to camera in your own words, and then there's voiceover or commentary, which is the skeleton that hangs the pieces to camera and bits together. That is normally rewritten in the edit by the director when the rushes come in, because you can never, as a writer, completely predict what shots you're going to get and what structure you're going to get. So generally, my initial scripts don't bear a huge resemblance to the finished edit scripts.
So they're kind of working documents, and I want to talk a little bit in a moment about the editing process. But I suppose before then, we should kind of think about what it's like to be on a shoot. So you're there day one on location. Obviously you've worked with interviews, but you've also worked with up close and personal with artworks and with documents and stuff like that. What's the work of shooting like for programs of this kind?
Exhausting. It's truly exhausting, I would say. People think of going on these shoots as very glamorous experiences, and certainly often the finished product of the program will make them look glamorous. Like I'm made to walk around in a suit in the desert or in the jungle, wherever I am, and it looks like I'm having a great time. Actually, I'm having a terrible time. No, in truth, I find shoots very satisfying, really enjoyable. You get to see extraordinary things. I've traveled all over the world with my filming. I've gone to see museums and galleries that have been closed to the public. I have had access to things and access to people that I would never otherwise have had. And also, they're great social experiences. Most productions are made by a small team of people. So you'll have a presenter, you'll have a director, you'll have a camera operator, a sound recordist, and a researcher. So it's normally 4 or 5 people, and you travel around the country or travel around the world together. You're staying in the same hotels, you're eating together, you're collaborating together. It's a really nice experience that doesn't actually happen that often as an academic, that idea of all pulling together in this very kind of almost physical way. But it is grueling, because often a shoot will be 10, 12 days long. You won't have a day off. You'll be doing 12-hour days at least. You won't be returning home. Often you're just returning to a hotel. And if you're making programs for the BBC, you are not staying in luxurious lodgings. You're staying in cheap hotels. You have a budget of, I think, £12 for a dinner. So it's and you're spending a lot of time sitting in a van. So it's not glamorous, but it is, I think, enjoyable. One thing I would say is that although I've been doing programs for a long time now, for well over a decade, I still get very nervous doing my pieces to camera, especially if it's a piece to camera in front of an important thing when we don't have much time, or I particularly hate it if people are listening or watching as you're delivering the piece to camera. That's always quite stressful. So it is nerve-wracking as well. It's a grueling experience. But some of the best experiences I've had in my career have been going to these extraordinary places, whether it's seeing Aboriginal rock art in Australia, or going into a tomb in an ancient Egyptian tomb just outside of Cairo, or going into the jungles of Japan. Whatever it is, these are great experiences.
I was wondering about what you've learnt kind of over the period, over the decade or so of making these. So, as you know, I have made one program, and one of the first things that I learned on a shoot, which was incredibly tiring, as you say, is so I've always known that I have a wonky eye, but I kind of tend to move around enough that maybe it's not incredibly visible. But it turns out that when you've got an extremely expensive TV camera pointed at you, that is the first thing that TV camera sees, and you have a cameraman who's very confused about why you're not looking directly at him. So that was something I had to learn, was kind of developing some way of coming around
Yes,
a particular issue.
It does make you very self-conscious in the worst possible way.
Yeah.
There are many times when at the end of a piece to camera that I thought I'd done well, they say, "Why did you do that with your tongue?" Or "Why did you do?" Or this constant like patting down of my head. I mean, the thing for me is I'm actually a slob. I mean, I'm very casual. I mean, I'm wearing tracksuit bottoms right now. I don't usually shave. I don't look at myself in the mirror. I look like a mess, as my wife is constantly telling me. And yet, when you go on these television programs, you have to be, to some extent, presentable. I mean, it's been quite controversial in the past when presenters have been. Like I remember Mary Beard was attacked by A.A. Gill for not being presentable. There is that pressure on you to because people are judging you on your appearance. So that is difficult. I've got to say, I never watch myself back. I never, in the edit, I might be looking at the rushes in the edit to try and work out the best way to cut something together, but I would never sit in front of the television and watch myself. I cannot think of a fate. That's a fate worse than death, to actually watch myself or listen to myself.
Oh, that may be something I should learn from as well, like kind of peering between the fingers or from behind the cushions. But yeah, I mean, you've mentioned there that process of the edit, so that point at which you kind of start adding in voiceover, but also choosing shots, choosing takes, things like that. Can you walk us through a little bit so I know that you've said to me before that this is a process that for you is really integral, and it's something where you like to be very, very involved in the work of the edit, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, the edit is typically where you lose complete control, because the edit is when the director will take the rushes that you've shot, and will sit in a dark room with an editor and will put them together. And in many cases, the film that you eventually see might bear no resemblance or very little resemblance to the film you thought you were making, or the script you thought you were writing. Invariably, the things you like most are removed. The things you don't like most are made more prominent. And so things are really changed. And it's a really difficult thing as a presenter to know what your rights are, and whether really you don't have any say. You've signed your form, you've done your recording. It's now their job to make the program work, not yours. So really, I mean, a director could say, don't come into the edit suite. But I mean, I will, I track them down. I bash that door open until I get in, because for me, it's very, for someone who spends a lot of time researching and writing these programs, a lot of time committed to the filming, I want to make sure that they still bear some semblance of my authorship in the edit. So I will spend a lot of time going in. When I say a lot of time, I mean, for an hour-long documentary, an edit might take 6 weeks or 7 weeks. I will probably go in 5 or 6 times, maybe once every week, just to see how things are getting on, to help read in voiceover, to help rewrite some of the voiceover for the director, and also to have thoughts about how we might rearrange things. But often, when you come with these thoughts, they don't to hear them.
But I think that's so interesting in thinking about the debates that you had to have and the claim you have to stake in order to be able to kind of, I'm not even going to say to have control, because that's, as you say, that's not how it actually works. But thinking about, I know that this is something that for many academics thinking about doing this kind of work, there's always that question about, you know, to what extent will I be allowed to make the case that I want to make a case in some case, and sometimes that's nuanced or complex or, you know, counterintuitive. And I think hearing a little bit about the different stages from research to the edit, where you're kind of plugging into that, seems, I think, really, really useful. Yeah, but to maintain that kind of authorial voice seems like a potentially a challenge depending on the project.
It is a real challenge, and you know there were, and I think anyone anyone considering going into this um, has to be aware of the fact that they are not simply going to be able to write exactly what they want. They're not going to be able to write just the essay that they like and then get a nice film made of it. That's not the way it works. There are a lot of trade-offs involved. There are a lot of compromises involved. There are a lot of cooks spoiling or making the broth. And you just have to realize that if you are going to get involved in it, the finished product will be a product of many people, and you may not be completely happy with it, and you may not be completely comfortable with it. And you know, nuance, subtlety, you know, these kinds of things don't generally translate that well onto television, whether you like it or not. And often, you know, you might write that into your script, but then the editor will cut it out. And then, you know, you'll have other academics saying, well, you didn't refer to this, or you didn't accept, you know, you didn't acknowledge that they're actually, this is slightly more complicated than that, or you didn't footnote this particular or reference this particular scholar when you said that. You have to realize that it's a different medium with different expectations, a different language, different grammar of communication. And I think if people realize that when they're going into it, they won't feel burned or so disappointed if it doesn't go their way.
Mm-hmm. Of course, humanities academics famously easygoing. We're also very good at working in teams. You know, it's natural that we would find ourselves so comfortable in this world. But I think it's really interesting to hear about, as you say, those trade-offs. And that kind of brings me pretty neatly to a question about how this fits in. So you're someone who's kind of had this, you know, this growing TV career and this growing TV profile alongside an academic career and a research career. And, you know, I often ask guests on this series of videos this because it's often the case when working in public facing and public engagement projects that there can be, I wouldn't necessarily say difficulties, but there are certainly challenges to whether it's getting university leaders to understand the value of work that's happening outside of the traditional research and teaching frameworks, or kind of selling the value to the field at large of doing kind of public facing work around a particular field or a particular topic. I wondered if that was, you know, is that something you've encountered about kind of having to articulate the value of the work that you do on TV to academics as well?
I mean, I would say that, you know, I always, as someone, as I said at the start, someone who became an academic partly because of the inspiration I got from academics on television or on radio, I always felt that those two went hand in glove. If you've done lots of research, if you've got ideas, if you have the ability to communicate, you should be using every medium at your disposal to do it. I think that the idea that an academic should just sort of sit in a silo and just write to a small audience of you know, people who have similar views and work in similar registers isn't necessarily the best thing to do. But I would say that for me, and I think for a number of people I know who've done this, for academics doing public facing work, it is a double-edged sword. I think I have to be honest about that, that on the one hand, you know, it raises your profile, it opens up opportunities for you, you get to reach audiences that you would never normally reach through traditional academic circuits. But at the same time, you know, some academics don't understand it, some academics resent it, some academics think it's not real, you know, academic work, and therefore you're just wasting your time. Some people will, you know, look at the programs and say, well, that's not, you know, that's too much of a simplification or a generalization. So I think it can it can damage your reputation and damage your career if you're not careful. And I think that this is another important thing I would say to any academic thinking of, or young academic in particular, who doesn't have tenure, getting involved in this. You've got to be careful what you choose, you know, what projects you choose, how early you go to do it, and because it can have, you know, it can have a backlash. It's possible that you could be applying for a job and someone would say, oh, that person's always on television, they're not sitting in the archive and doing their academic research. So I think you have to be careful and try to balance things out as much as possible. I don't think I've always got that right, I'll be honest. I think that there are times when I've made compromises that I shouldn't have made, when I've made a program that I didn't really feel was right for me, but I did it anyway. And you know, if I could go back in time, I would have not made those mistakes. But it's a challenge. It is a challenge to juggle anything in a
I
career.
think I've heard so many people reflect on, you know, it's the difficulty, but also the importance sometimes of knowing your own boundaries, of knowing when to say no, of knowing, but also conversely of knowing when to stretch yourself, when to kind of take a risk on something as well. And I guess that's something that we continue to learn and we continue to think about as time goes on. I suppose the very last thing I was going to ask James, if I could, was, you know, because as you say, you've been doing this for a decade, you've changed your practice, you've learned a lot about it, and you've made kind of ever bigger and better programs. Are there, you know, if you could kind of tap James from 2009 on the shoulder and say, right, you're about to get into this, here's one or two things you should really know, what would you say?
Oh, that's a tough question, John. I think there are a couple of things I would probably say. I mean, within the craft itself, I would say, you know, when you are doing when you are presenting a television program or a radio program, don't think of it as a lecture. Don't think of it as public speaking. It is private speaking. You are speaking to one other person sitting on their sofa or sitting on their armchair, and you're having a conversation with them. I think the other thing I would say is, you know, don't be pretentious. You know, academics, you know, the best presenters are the people who wear their knowledge lightly. They don't try to impress other academics or other curators to show how much they know. They try and explain what they do know as clearly and simply as possible. So avoiding jargon, avoiding trying to impress, and just trying to communicate. The other broader piece of advice I would say to myself 10, 11 years ago is don't take everything that comes your way. It's very easy when you're an academic to be flattered by a production company or a channel or a broadcaster approaching you and asking you to do things. Most of the things they ask you to do will not be interesting to you or will not be up your street, or you won't feel confident talking about them. And I would say to myself, and I would say to others, you know, if you're good at this, if you like doing it, you will get opportunities in the future. Make sure that they are on your terms and you're doing only projects that are interesting to you, because I think you'll pay the price otherwise.
That's really fantastic. Well, I'm certainly grateful that when I rang you up, you agreed to come on camera for this. James, thank you so much for coming and sharing this. I know that I'm certainly very grateful for it, and our viewers of the Society for Renaissance Studies hopefully have a lot to chew on and a lot to think about in their own kind of public-facing work as well. Thanks so much, James.
Thank you, John.